We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My questions for the Premier. This past May, the Auditor General appeared before the Public Accounts Committee to discuss the Maintenance Enforcement Program. This program acts as a critical go-between for maintenance recipients and payers. The program, according to the Auditor General, services 15,000 cases. Captured, though, in those cases are 13,000 children. The Auditor General found at the time of his audit there were $63 million in uncollected maintenance payments. Does the Premier know if any progress has been made in ensuring that these recipients get the payments they are entitled to and what the outstanding balance is as of today?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to assure her most recent budget we've increased the support that we'll be working in maintenance and enforcement to ensure that the money that is owing to children across this province is paid. We also worked with the national government to ensure the new Justice Bill included a component of that Justice Bill was that if a divorce happens, goes through the court, and that we believed if there was a child maintenance as part of that, that all of the important information that were required, if someone wasn't paying that maintenance, would be submitted to the court so that the custodial parent wouldn't have to continually going back to the justice system to have orders enforced. And I want to be very clear, Mr. Speaker, this money is owed to children across this province, and if the court orders you to pay it, we expect you to pay it.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
I'd like to thank the Premier for his answer. Obviously, recipients rely on these payments for day-to-day expenses just like us. When these payments are delayed or never collected, there are real consequences, including Nova Scotians who end up on social assistance, unfortunately. According to the Auditor General's findings, workers in maintenance enforcement face caseloads as high as 450 files each. No wonder so much money goes uncollected. So does the Premier believe that his government is dedicating sufficient resources to managing the maintenance enforcement program?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, and again I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, we've made additional investments into that program since the information the Auditor General is referring to.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
There are many more questions raised by the Auditor General. His report deserves greater examination, and the department should answer for these findings. The Public Accounts Committee shut down 3 weeks early this summer. Our caucus asked that those 3 weeks be filled with the issues raised in the Auditor General's report. But the government used their majority on the Public Accounts Committee to block the witnesses and avoid the topics, and everyone start their vacation early. So I'd like to know, why should Nova Scotians trust that they will ever get any answers when this government directs its members to shut down Public Accounts Committee early?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question, Mr. Speaker. I want to tell her that this government in public accounts sits twice as much as the next province in the country, Mr. Speaker. We continue to sit more than any other Canadian province to scrutinize and be able to have the books open. The Auditor General is very clear. He comes in, he made recommendations around maintenance and enforcement, Mr. Speaker. We're implementing those recommendations. On top of that, we've made investments to hire more people in that branch, Mr. Speaker. But let me be very clear. This is not something that started in 2013. But we're the first government, Mr. Speaker, to actually make the investments to take this serious, because this money's owed to children. And if the court says you owe it, we expect you to pay it. And if you don't, we're going to do everything we can to ensure that you do.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
2 weeks ago today, over 24 community groups and environmental groups and businesses and trade unions met to issue the 2030 declaration, a declaration which calls on the government to adopt greenhouse gas emission reduction targets of 50% of 1990 levels by 2030. This would bring us in Nova Scotia in alignment with our country's national commitments on the Paris Agreement, and it would place us at the forefront of GHG reductions in the entire country. So I want to re-express to the Premier the question that was asked 2 weeks ago. Will he support the 2030 declaration and the reduction of 50% of 1990 by 2030?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. I want to reassure him that we are continuing to do the good work that was provided by former Minister of Environment from Kings North, a Minister of Environment who served under the Democratic Party, and a number who served in this party, to continue to make sure Nova Scotia is a leader in the country. Mr. Speaker, we're 30% below 2005 levels now. We'll be on target to be near 50% in 2030. We're continuing to make adjustments. That we're not saying that's good enough. We're going to continue to make improvements, whether it's home adaptation programs, ensuring that we continue to make sure and reduce our individual carbon footprint, Mr. Speaker, so that we are and continue to be the leader in Canada.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
Nothing about what the Premier has said changes the fact, however, and this is one of the great concerns of the signatories of the 2030 Declaration, that we have stagnated on this, and in fact are not moving forwards but are moving backwards in our commitments to climate change. So we have the 2020 targets because these were part of the all-party process the Premier has spoken about of the environmental goals and sustainable prosperity legislation. But that legislation was to have been reviewed and renewed in 2017. It hasn't been, and that leaves us today in the situation in Nova Scotia where we have no 2030 targets whatsoever. So I want to ask the Premier, why won't he commit to reaching the 2030 declaration level, the 50% reduction of 1990 by 2030, as a part of the renewing and the reviewing of the EGSPA legislation?
The Honourable Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There was two components to that piece of legislation. One was continue to make sure that we continue to reduce our greenhouse gas production, Mr. Speaker. Nova Scotians should be proud of the work they've been doing. We're leading the country. We'll be well on target for our 2030 targets, Mr. Speaker. The other component of that, Mr. Speaker, was economic growth. We're continuing to make sure that we protect the environment. At the same time, our economy is growing, Mr. Speaker. We're making investments. More young people are choosing to stay in this province. We buck the trend that's happening outside. We see our population growing. We're seeing investments in the private sector, Mr. Speaker. We're doing both, Mr. Speaker. We're protecting the environment and growing the economy.
The Honourable Leader of the New Democratic Party.
This is exactly the point, growing the economy and economic growth. We know that today in Canada there are more people working in renewable energy and in energy efficiency than in all of oil and gas and mining and working in the woods put together. And we know that we have the evidence to show from the Green Economy Network that if we adopted the 2030 Declaration, we'd be able in Nova Scotia to create 30,000 person years of work in the areas of sustainable transportation and renewable energy and in energy efficiency. So I want to ask the Premier, is he not concerned that by failing to adopt the 50% below 1990 by 2030 target, we are in fact missing out on one of the real economic opportunities of our generation?
The Honourable Premier.
No, Mr. Speaker. I believe we can do both, Mr. Speaker. We're continuing to ensure that we provide those who are working in our economy today stability, that the jobs will be there for them tomorrow. At the same time, making investments in future opportunities, Mr. Speaker, while we're protecting the environment. Many people throw out all of these stats, Mr. Speaker, veering right or left. The fact of the matter is this is a balanced approach. We've continued to make sure that this province leads the country. Every political party in this House should be proud of the work they've started. It's under the former member from Kings North who started this down the road. All parties supported it through successive elections. When Nova Scotians have changed governments, we've continued down the path to ensuring that we stayed on target to reduce greenhouse gases. The difference, Mr. Speaker, is our party believes as we do that, we should provide economic opportunity for young Nova Scotians, and we're seeing just that. A balanced approach, Mr. Speaker, is providing good opportunities and at the same time protecting the environment.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you. My question's for the Premier. In previous sessions, my colleagues and I have asked the Premier to commit to building a walk-in clinic for veterans. A walk-in clinic that understands the needs of our veterans and is set up specifically for them, Mr. Speaker. It is an idea that is supported by the All-Party Veterans Affairs Committee, and the Premier has, on multiple occasions, expressed his support for the idea. He has said, however, that he believes that it is the responsibility of the federal government to provide such a clinic. Since the last sitting, has the Premier had the opportunity to raise this important issue with the Prime Minister or others in the federal government, and has there been a positive response?
The Honourable Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I have had the opportunity to raise this issue with the national government. As you would also know, there is a facility in this city that is providing those services now that are being received by some veterans. Mr. Speaker, what we're looking at, what is the best avenue to make sure that we can provide a broader scope of services to those requiring the PTSD support, and we look forward to that coming to a successful conclusion.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
In recent weeks, we have learned that Veterans Affairs Canada had agreed to pay for the PTSD treatment for Christopher Garney. Christopher, as you may recall, developed PTSD after killing an off-duty police officer and disposing her body in a compost bin. Christopher Garney himself has not served our country, but receives the funding as a family member of a veteran. The Premier has already voiced his opposition to this funding, and he did so immediately and directly to the Minister of Veterans Affairs, and I do commend him for doing that. But I do want to ask the Premier, in his conversations with the Minister of Veterans Affairs, did he ask that any new money that was coming here to Nova Scotia should go towards a veterans walk-in clinic, and unfortunately not to a convicted police killer?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, what I have spoken to the Minister about is what is the best way for the national government to pay for a service inside of our province, whether it is the new clinic or whether it is not to support a clinic that is currently working, that is providing services not to enough veterans. What she's referring to, Mr. Speaker, when I spoke to the Minister around this very issue about Mr. Garnier receiving support, we need to be very careful in the fact that family members of people who serve our country receive PTSD from the fact of the service of their parent. And that's exactly what this was for. I believe somebody made the mistake, and I've made it very clear that I do not believe we should be paying for PTSD services for Mr. Garnier in our justice system. Their justice system will deal with them. The services and supports that are there for all of those incarcerated should be provided to him. But the money that is inside of Veterans Affairs to cover services for veterans and their families should go directly to those who are impacted by the service of the loved one.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Minister of Education. For the past 2 weeks, I've been hearing from parents in Dartmouth North who are frustrated with the chaos and confusion around busing to and from our schools. Our amazing teachers and principals have gone above and beyond to support our children through this completely unacceptable situation. The minister has now promised a review, but he should never have allowed this situation to happen in the first place. Mr. Speaker, can the minister please explain why he didn't ensure that there was a plan for busing before school started in September?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We know that a number of parents had some significant concerns related to bus timing. We've asked and directed the region to fix those immediate challenges. So we're at about 98% of our buses getting to and from school on time. The amount of negative feedback coming into the region is slowing, and MLAs are getting some positive feedback that their parents' case files are being dealt with in a timely manner. So that shows me that there's been improvements made. But we are now able to take a look holistically, province-wide, on busing policies and practices to make sure that we're doing our very best from one end of the province to the next.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, I have not yet received positive feedback from any parents. In fact, the calls to my office are ramping up with more complaints. Yesterday, I spoke with a group of parents who were waiting with their children for the bus. That particular bus was 10 minutes late yesterday, but the route is actually scheduled to arrive at the school 5 minutes after the bell. The children on this route are automatically put at a disadvantage. They're rushing to get started in the morning. They're not able to play with their friends when they arrive. And when the bus is late, as it was yesterday, or in the winter when they have to deal with snowsuits or whatever, it will get worse. So, Mr. Speaker, does the minister really think it is acceptable that a school bus is scheduled so that these children are late for school every day?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I think every parent and student in this province has a right to expect on-time, safe, reliable, efficient busing service. And we are committed to improving the service to better meet the needs of our students and communities. The governance changes that we've made in the system will allow us to actually have a provincial view on this, to play a direct and active role on it. And that's why we are taking action on these issues so that parents can expect better in the future. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. Mr. Speaker, ambulance wait at the emergency department to offload patients because of overcrowding in the emergency departments. According to the NSGEO Code Critical Report, one nurse reported times where there were 14 ambulances backed up while paramedics waited with patients. When ambulances are waiting to offload patients at the emergency departments, ambulance coverage around the HRM suffers, which can affect other areas of the province. So my question to the Minister is, what is the plan to address the issue of ambulance gridlock across Nova Scotia emergency departments?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this question to the floor of the legislature. I'm pleased to advise him, all members of the legislature, of the great work that's been done under the leadership at Dartmouth General Hospital Emergency Department, along with our partners at the EHS system. This was an initiative that they started about 10 months ago, Mr. Speaker, that changed the way that they offload ambulances at that hospital. They've seen very good success in improving the offload times. And Mr. Speaker, there's work ongoing with the NSHA and our partners, the EHS, to look at ways to validate the results that they've been seeing on the ground and move it out to other sites.
The Honourable Member for Northside Westmount.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the situation has gotten so bad that the union representing Nova Scotia paramedics has been tweeting for 5 months using hashtag CodeCritical to raise awareness about ambulance availability. There's been reports in some instances within a province where there has taken up to 2 hours for an ambulance to arrive at the scene. The ambulance system is in disarray and paramedics are asking for the Minister's help because their members are getting fatigued. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is, why have you not answered the union who represents Nova Scotia paramedics when they call for a summit with other healthcare partners so Nova Scotians can receive the service they deserve?
I'd just like to remind the Honourable Member to keep his questions directed through the Chair, the Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to report to my colleagues through you, Mr. Chair, that in fact I've met with frontline healthcare workers, including paramedics. I believe it was the member of the NDP that suggested perhaps I'd go out and do a tour with some paramedics. I did that this spring, where I was able to go out and see paramedics firsthand in hospitals waiting, Mr. Speaker, with offload. I had that opportunity both at the Halifax Infirmary and Dartmouth General, as well as other paramedics, Mr. Speaker. I've spoken to unions. I've gotten the feedback and the information, as I've mentioned in my first response. Work is underway to address these issues.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And my question through you is for the Minister of TIR. Mr. Speaker, in what may be the least shocking report ever released, Statistics Canada has said that the roads in Nova Scotia are in terrible shape. The data was collected from 1,500 government organizations across Canada, and the numbers are as jarring as the potholes are here in Nova Scotia. 49% of Nova Scotia's highways are rated as poor or very poor. The Canadian average is 17.1%. Now, Mr. Speaker, I want to say that again. The Canadian average is 17.1%, and in Nova Scotia, it is almost triple that figure. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister of Transportation please explain how it came to be that half of our highways would be rated so poorly?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite for the question. First of all, Mr. Speaker, I want to publicly thank the over 2,200 people who are employed by our department who are working hard to preserve the safety of the roads in Nova Scotia, not counting the thousands of people, Nova Scotians, who are employed by the contractors who go out daily to fix and repair these roads. Mr. Speaker. Safety is our top priority in the department. We have 23,000 kilometres of roads. Because we are such an old province and because our roads have evolved with us as we've been populated over the last 400 years, we have special challenges to preserve that network for all our citizens in every part of our province, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, the minister is right. The men and women who do work on our highways are fantastic individuals. But they can only do, Mr. Speaker, with what they've been given, and they haven't been given enough to do the work they need to do. Mr. Speaker, the way that this government operates, tomorrow we'll probably read a press release congratulating the government for making the repair industry in the auto section a success because of all the bad accidents they've had on these poor roads. I'll go back to the report, Mr. Speaker, from Statistics Canada. 49% of the highways, 43% of the arteries, and 39% of the collector roads are rated as poor or very poor. The odds of driving on a safe road shouldn't be the same as the odds of a coin flip. Mr. Speaker, can the minister explain why Nova Scotians should trust that there is any chance of our highways improving?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, particularly his comment about the commitment of this government to our budget. $285 million in capital projects this year, up $60 million, the third highest budget in the history, the proud history of this province, Mr. Speaker. $60 million dedicated to the improving the safety of our highways, to our twinning program, the improvement of our bridges, which continues every day. And we are very proud of our road system in Nova Scotia and the commitment of this government to improve it, make it safe, and make it better for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I think all members of this House appreciate how vital AEDs, or automatic external defibrillators, are to saving lives. These machines are portable, battery operated, and almost anyone can use them. Statistics show that most AEDs that you see will never be used. But the problem comes when an AED is needed and cannot be seen. We all know about the tragic death of Michael Foley. A life-saving AED was only 700 metres from where he collapsed. By some estimates, there are more than 1,000 AEDs in our province, but only about half of them are on the provincial registry. So my question to the Minister of Health, can the Minister update the House on what action he is taking to make sure the registry is accurate?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the member's right. We did implement a registry last year to track the AED systems within our province. I encourage all Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker, if they're aware of an AED in their community, to either contact or advise the owners of the AED of the registry so that they can encourage them to contact. Mr. Speaker, it's something I do. It's something that I encourage others to do. Every member of this legislature can do that within their own communities. Let the people know that this registry now exists. It wouldn't have necessarily been there when they purchased their AEDs. The other thing, Mr. Speaker, that's important is work is ongoing to integrate with the 911 system so that we can provide that integration and deliver the information. But that takes computer system upgrades, Mr. Speaker. That work, too, is ongoing. The
Honourable Member for Victoria the Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, Mr. Speaker, even if the registry was up to date, EHS dispatch is not able to tell callers the location of the nearest AED. And I'll table a global story to that effect. I know there are plans to fully integrate the system to include telling callers the location. If that integration hasn't happened, it's vital that it be done immediately. If it has happened, it hasn't been well communicated. It's a simple step that, without a question, will save lives. So can the Minister tell the House when the registry will be integrated with the EHS and commit to a public education program?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, I do thank the member for bringing this topic to the floor of the legislature. It is a great opportunity to bring awareness to all of the members here. I encourage all members to go back to their communities and spread the word as well. We have encouraged and have taken steps to let people know about the registry. Again, it's being administered online that people can register, I believe, as well. The work, though, Mr. Speaker, for us to do the integration is ongoing. I don't have a date for when that integration will be done, but we'll be sure to let all Nova Scotians know.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. In 2014, the Nova Scotia School Board Association asked the department to review the rules around school busing and provide adequate funding for transportation of students to and from school. In 2017, the same request came from the Halifax Regional School Board. And now, with no school boards, after 2 weeks of stories of students being stranded and families scrambling to fill the gaps, the minister has finally said he will conduct a review, and we look forward to seeing the results of that review. But, Mr. Speaker, why has the minister dragged his feet for years on finding a solution to this problem?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. We've had an ambitious agenda for transformation in our education system. We've made significant changes in the governance of our system, the administration of our system. The issues that people have told us in this chamber and in our communities that were most urgent were behavioral supports for our system. That was the focus of our first year in office, bringing in a new pre-primary program so that every single 4-year-old in this province has access to critical early learning, expanding our child care sector, Mr. Speaker. It's funny, every time we've moved quickly and ambitiously on these projects, the opposition parties have told us to slow down, that we're being reckless. The fact is that we can't do everything at one time. We had a plan this year to review busing, to review funding formulas and guidance counselor ratios, and that work is going to be ongoing for this year, and I expect to have improvements in every single one of those areas.
The honourable member for Dartmouth South.
Mr. Speaker, with respect, the School Board Association submitted this request 4 years ago, long before the litany of changes that were just rattled off were ever even conceived. Mr. Speaker, Wayne McKay, a Dalhousie University law professor who's authored books on laws governing Canadian education, was recently quoted as saying the busing issue could easily be resolved or more easily dealt with if we still had a school board structure. The removal of that level of representation and democracy comes at a certain price, and I'll table that. The department has said the review will look at policies and practices, but what about listening to parents? Mr. Speaker, will the minister explain how he will consult with students and parents, like the ones who have been flooding my office, as he tries to fix the situation around school busing?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I know that the members opposite have defended the status quo in our education system. They've defended the previous governance structure that 3 independent reports indicated was creating a situation where student achievement varied from region to region.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, that system that the members opposite defend resulted in a situation where, depending on where you went to school in this province, your chances of succeeding varied. 3 independent reports told us that governance and administration was a problem, Mr. Speaker. That's why we acted, because we think we need to do better for our students. And while the members opposite defend the special interest that we've taken on this journey, we will stand firmly behind the students and their success. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question for the Minister of Business. Many of my constituents and many Nova Scotians are anxiously awaiting improved rural internet service. I understand that the government has split the program into 2 parts. They have a trust which will fund internet improvements, and they have a reconstituted company, I guess, which is going to oversee the deployment. I've heard that the cost across the province could be $300 to $500 million. I understand the initial seed funding in the trust in March was $120 million. I just wonder if the minister can clarify if that trust is still at $120 million, or if more money has been put into that trust, or maybe even any spent so far.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question. And of course, this is a program and a project and an initiative that we're very proud of on this side of the House. We're embarking on an unprecedented level of spending per capita within the Federation for broadband and internet connectivity for all of our citizens. The number now stands in the Internet Trust at $193 million. What the Internet Trust will do is it'll hold that money within the confines of its mandate, and Develop Nova Scotia will bring forward projects, initiatives on behalf of municipalities, communities, ISPs who are working with communities across the province, obviously in strategic areas that require satellite, wireless, or of course hardwired fiber optic cable known as the middle mile, and of course the last mile. So this is the work that's ongoing now. Develop Nova Scotia sets up these projects. The Internet Trust reviews them and makes a final decision. And again, the number at this point is $193 million.
The honourable member for Pictou East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the minister for updating the House on that number of $193 million. Just wonder if the minister can give us a bit of a timeline on when the actual deployments would actually start. So the money's there now, and now the process will actually start to unfold. So if the minister can just give us some indication, I can tell the people in Pictou East that are waiting for improvements to the rural internet when they may expect to see some of those.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and again, thank the member for the question. And I did want to go back to something I missed in the first question. The number that Bright Star identified for Nova Scotia was at a maximum level, at a peak, would be $500 million. With what that 193 leverage with federal dollars, of course, and the private sector, which will play a role here. This initial investment by itself will get us a good ways along to 95% access and connectivity for all Nova Scotians that have been identified here. Because of the nature of this program and the fact that it is uncharted water for any province within the country, Develop Nova Scotia is building the foundation from the ground up. So how we're going to do it, how we're going to work with communities, what recommendations we're going to take forward is critical to get it right. They are doing that work now. They are doing consultations across the province. We certainly hope the money will be outflowing and flowing in a significant way by late fall. Yeah, thanks.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Health. My office can barely keep up with calls from constituents who are concerned about how this government is undermining health care at the Roseway Hospital. Time and time again, I've brought the legitimate concerns to the floor of the legislature, only to be given the same old non-committal responses by this Minister of Health. Just a few days ago, I rose in this House to ask the minister specifically about the future of Roseway Hospital. He has deferred, he has talked around the issue, and he's been vague. My question to the minister is pretty simple. Will he give me his word today that for as long as he is the minister responsible for health and wellness, the Roseway Hospital will remain an open, full-service hospital? A simple yes or no is all I'm looking for.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for bringing this question forward. As I've said before, Mr. Speaker, my mandate is quite clear to all Nova Scotians. My responsibility, Mr. Speaker, is to ensure that we assess and work with our partners to develop the appropriate care initiatives and services for primary care and acute care throughout the province. Mr. Speaker, we work with our frontline partners in healthcare to do that. We've seen investments and expansion in investments for physicians, for nurse practitioners, Mr. Speaker, to help with the primary care access across this province, Mr. Speaker. We've listened to frontline workers. We've made these investments and will continue to do that.
The honourable member for Queens Shelburne.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, we all know the Minister of Health's mandate. That's why I keep asking the questions. The minister claims to work and make his decisions based upon the information that comes to his attention in the best interest of Nova Scotians. It's not in the best interest of my constituents that don't have a family doctor. It's not in the best interest of my constituents who have to travel 12 to 14 hours or sit 12 to 14 hours in an ER because theirs is not open. And it's not in the best interest of my constituents who have to have their lab work tested at another hospital. My question to the minister is, will he leave his office tower in Halifax and join the current concerned residents in Shelburne County at the People Over Politics rally on September 22nd? Let's try this again, Mr. Speaker. A simple yes or no is all I'm looking for the constituents of Shelburne.
Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Again, for the member, when I was in Shelburne, met toward the Roseway facility, saw the start of the construction of the clinic that's being built there in the community to help with primary care. access. Mr. Speaker, that work is ongoing. I was advised that they have more family physicians in that community than they'd had in decades,
Order,
Mr.
please. The Honourable Minister of Health.
That they have more family physicians in the community than they'd had in decades, Mr. Speaker, that the work that we can continue to invest in for communities like Shelburne and across the province, Mr. Speaker, will continue. We continue to work with our partners at the Nova Scotia Health Authority and communities across this province to demonstrate the attractive opportunities to provide primary care throughout this province.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Last year, the official opposition called on the government to slow down and delay pre-primary by 1 year to ensure the program was properly and fairly implemented. As the minister knows, the rushed rollout of pre-primary has resulted in issues like access to playground equipment, as well as enrollment challenges. I have a constituent who wishes to enroll her child at Admiral Westfall Elementary, where there are only 4 enrolled in the pre-primary classes out of a possible 24. My colleague from Cole Harbour Eastern Passage has a similar situation. There is room for 20 more students, but the rules governing catchment areas are preventing this family from accessing pre-primary. Interesting, Mr. Speaker, the minister just indicated to this House every 4-year-old will have access to pre-primary. Is the minister prepared to follow common sense and allow flexibility within the rules governing pre-primary catchment areas? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The member actually speaks to the biggest challenge we're actually having with the rollout of pre-primary, and that's keeping up with demand that we have in our communities, Mr. Speaker. There's been a number of these cases that have come forward where parents want their kids to access pre-primary outside of catchment. We do have to treat everybody equally. We do have to have some logic applied to the situation so that we can broaden this reach as far as possible. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at the out-of-catchment policy right now, and I hope to have some answers for the member and for all of those that are trying to access this program who want us to move more quickly with it by the end of the month.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the minister that the purpose of policy and procedure is to create a sense of fairness, to create a sense of equality of opportunity, not to defy common sense. Sometimes, Mr. Speaker, having common sense and flexibility from a situation like this is resulting in enormous frustration for my constituents. And because of a lack of consideration, families are missing out on an educational opportunity, and the pre-primary program at Admiral Westfall is nowhere near capacity. This government is excluding students because of poor planning, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister allow school principals and the regional education centres the same flexibility with pre-primary as they do from primary to grade 12? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, thank you very much for the question. We are working on policy so that out-of-catchment cases and requests can be treated fairly and equally all across the province, Mr. Speaker. And we will do our very best to keep up with demand as Nova Scotians express it. But the irony that member now is challenging us on increasing the access to this program, a program that that party voted against, opposed. One of the leadership candidates said they would get rid of it if they were Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker. I hope it's not lost on this House or the member of that member's community.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture. Rising sea levels and more frequent storms are already impacting our wharves and coastal infrastructure. Last month, a warm water tiger shark was caught off our shores for the first time ever, and the Department of Fisheries and Oceans is reporting that ocean temperatures in Atlantic Canada are 2 to 3 degrees higher than average. At the same time, fisheries to the south of us are predicting declining lobster stocks as temperatures rise even further. So my question for the minister is, what is he doing to make sure this government is addressing the risks that climate change poses to our fisheries?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries and Aquaculture.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the minister for her, for her question. It's a serious concern for us, and the catches in the lobster industry in Maine have got smaller, and also there's more soft-shell lobsters. So it's something we're watching. We're looking at different areas for harvesting fish and different approaches. So as the time goes on, it's a slow process of climate change, and we're working with the industry to address it.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the Minister for that answer. Mr. Speaker, this summer the Cape Sharp tidal turbine spun for 6 weeks in the Minas Passage without fish kill monitoring equipment in place. It was in violation of its environmental assessment, but this government had no plan for bringing it back into compliance. For years, fishers have expressed concerns about the impact of tidal turbines, and this regulatory failure has done nothing to reassure them. Does the minister think this regulatory failure by the Department of Environment is acceptable?
The Honourable Minister of Fisheries.
I refer that to the Minister for Mines and Energy.
The Honourable Minister of Mines and Energy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank the member for the question. I would update the host that we've been working with the partners of the Cape Sharp turbine. We made it quite clear to them that they needed to get back into compliance, that they needed to work together to ensure that monitoring was put back in place. The staff is on the ground now. Partners are working together to monitor the turbine, and I'm confident in the process moving forward.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is to the Minister of Health and Wellness. Mr. Speaker, many of the people who are in my constituency use the Glace Bay General as their ER area, and this summer the Premier and the Minister of Health came to CBRM to announce improvements to the ER in Glace Bay. Now, after that announcement, the emergency room in Glace Bay was closed over 350 hours from July 29th to August the 14th. That's 350 hours out of a possible 408. And that, Mr. Speaker, is one of the area hospitals that this government says is staying open. With this crisis in healthcare in this province, people in my area wonder where will they turn when an emergency arises. So the question for the Minister through you is, will the Minister please update the House when his plan for the future of healthcare in CBRM will be available so that the people of the area know where to turn in an emergency?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the member acknowledging the investments that we announced for the Cape Breton region, Mr. Speaker, including investments in Waterford, Northside, Cape Breton, in Sydney, and in Glace Bay, Mr. Speaker. With respect to the emergency room specifically, as I mentioned yesterday in my remarks during debate, Dr. Chris Milburn, who is an emergency room physician in Cape Breton, he acknowledged that these investments in modernizing and expanding ER departments in Sydney and Glace Bay will in fact have a positive effect on both recruitment and retention of physicians providing emergency room services, Mr. Speaker. That's what this investment is about, is actually the long-term care investment into the future of healthcare for the residents of Cape Breton.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, it's beyond me, Mr. Speaker, how anybody can say closing hospitals is an investment. A quick check of the Nova Scotia Health Authority shows the need of 3 full-time family physicians in Glace Bay and countless others throughout CBRM. Deliverables for these positions include running family practice office, clinics, providing call coverage, caring for inpatients at the Glace Bay General Hospital. Opportunity is available to work in the emergency room, provide obstetrical care, or assist in the UR. So the question to the Minister is quite simple. Can the Minister explain to the good people of the CBRM how only 3 people can possibly provide quality, timely care to patients when the demands on these positions are so great?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to recognize, of course, the great work of all of our primary health care professionals and professionals providing care to Nova Scotians throughout the healthcare system. Mr. Speaker, the positions that the member cited are available. We want to encourage them and communities. We know that communities like Cumberland, Mr. Speaker, down the Digby area are coming together to demonstrate the value. I know last year Cape Breton came together to launch a video to help promote the region, Mr. Speaker. I encourage the member to support those initiatives to highlight just how great it is to work in Cape Breton, just like other communities are doing across this province, because Nova Scotia is a great place to work for physicians. Our recruitment incentives are competitive, Mr. Speaker, and I encourage everyone to support the initiatives of the Nova Scotia Health Authorities. They recruit healthcare professionals to provide care to all Nova Scotians. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Transportation, Infrastructure and Renewal. In the lead up to a by-election, this government announced 2 major infrastructure projects for Cumberland South. On April 17th, it was reported that the province would replace a closed bridge over the Napan River. When he made the announcement, the minister said he expected construction to begin during this construction season to be completed in 2019. Yesterday, I received a letter from the minister saying the department expects to prepare a tender so that construction can begin 2019-20 construction season. I will table that letter. Will the minister explain what unforeseen issues are delaying the construction of this bridge a full year?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member may be aware, the bridge in question was advanced considerably to meet the demands that are in the area there. And as a matter of fact, we did quite a bit of work to the abutment, so we would be in a good position to get the bridge constructed. The bridge process in the province involves making sure that we get good design, that we get safe design, and I can assure the member that that particular replacement is at the top of the list for us in terms of what we're going to do, and will be absolutely completed in the 2019 season.
The Honourable Member for Cumberland South.
I'm not sure what the unforeseen circumstances are yet, but Mr. Speaker, until the bridge is built, the residents are forced to take a detour around that route. The detour also diverts traffic onto a road that is not acceptable for this volume of traffic. This can only lead to a deterioration of yet more roads in this area. A substitute today's problem will be tomorrow's problem. Will the minister update the House on exactly when motorists in Cumberland County can expect to drive on a new Rainbow Bridge?
The Honourable Minister of Health. Minister of Transportation.
And I understand the inconvenience that that provides in the community, and we certainly apologize for that. However, our bridge replacement process means that we do it and we get it right. This is a significant structure. We want to make sure we have the right design in there to do that so that it will last for an additional 75 years, as long as the previous one did.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the summer, I received numerous complaints from constituents about an exorbitant amount of weeds and brush growing along the roadsides in Cape Breton-Richmond, along the highways. It was so severe in some areas, actually, that 2 pedestrians were almost hit by vehicles. The brush and weeds are more than just an eyesore for residents and visitors. It's actually interfering with mobility and visibility for vehicles and pedestrians. The department has brush cutting and mowing guidelines that include visibility of traffic signs and passing clearances for vehicles. But I'm concerned, Mr. Speaker, that pedestrian mobility is not a priority, and I'll table those documents. Mr. Speaker, could the minister please confirm that his department is obligated to clear highway brush to ensure pedestrian mobility and not simply vehicle mobility?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And yes, this province is subject to robust vegetation growth, which on the one side could be a blessing in many instances, Mr. Speaker. However, this government, in the previous budget, committed additional funds of over $2 million to brush cutting and vegetation control on our highway system. And I'm very happy to say that that is showing results, Mr. Speaker, across the province. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton-Richmond.
Mr. Speaker, as far as the robust vegetation growth, I can assure you that it's not being dealt with properly in my constituency. The situation might be less critical in my constituents if TIR had sufficient resources in our area. I understand that the department has only 1 mower available for 3 counties. It's absolutely ridiculous. When that mower inevitably breaks, the weeds and the brush don't stop growing, as the minister has pointed out. There's no backup, there's no plan B, and also there's a backlog, basically, in the system. Mr. Speaker, this is more than simply beautification. My constituency has a very high population of seniors, and mobility is important to their livelihood as well as their health. Could the minister please commit today to the acquisition of another mower for Cape Breton-Richmond and the surrounding counties?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member opposite opposite for the question. The commitment that we have made to increasing the availability of equipment for mowing is evident. Mr. Speaker, we are deploying more brush cutting. I think we got more brush cutting done in this season than we had for many, many years, and it's our intention. It's our intention to continue that, not only in the member's constituency, because the grass grows everywhere in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, and we're going to cut it everywhere.
The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
Mr. Speaker, earlier this week I questioned the Minister of Community Services about the Wood Street Secure Care Centre.
Order, please. The honourable member for Dartmouth North.
A legal aid lawyer representing a young person held in the Waterville Youth Jail told a reporter that his client was offered a deal. She was told that she could sign a form promising good behaviour and be released, but she refused to sign the document because she believed that her social worker would then send her to the Wood Street Centre. Mr. Speaker, this young woman chose jail over Wood Street. I want to believe the minister when she says the safety of the children in her care are of the utmost importance, but I'm not confident that they meet the standard when children would prefer to be in jail. Is the Minister confident that children at Wood Street are receiving the therapeutic services they need?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
I want to thank the honourable member for her question.
Order,
and I would
please. Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired.